Okay, this video here is going to walk you through how to use the quadratic formula and when to use it. What you're looking for in your equation is hopefully a term in the equation with x squared as the highest exponent. If you have that, that's the first thing you can do to be able to use the quadratic formula. Another thing you need to have in the equation is hopefully, eventually, arranged is all the terms on one side of the equal sign, and then have 0 on the other side. So the next thing you need to do is, once you have that arranged all on one side of the equal sign, then you got to figure out what is the a, b, and c numbers of the equation. So let's look at this next example here that I have and try to determine out what a, b, and c are. So if you look at this example here, I got three things. I got 3x squared plus 2x plus 5. The a term, again, is right next to this x squared. The b term is right next to the x, and c is the number that's all by itself. So it's pretty plain to see that you can see a, b, and c in this example here. We got 3, 2, and 5, as you see there, are your three terms with the that you're going to be using with the formula in just a minute. So next thing is, let's here see another example that doesn't start out as nice. Let's say I have 4x squared plus 2 equals 3x. Well, the problem with this one is that they're not all on the same side of the equal sign. So if I subtract 3x to both sides, then I'll get this new equation, negative 4x squared minus 3x plus 2 equals 0. Okay? So again, it's important to make sure you get all the terms over to one side of the equal sign, then you can decide what a, b, and c are. I find that some people try to not arrange the equation and you end up making small mistakes, and that's one of the first places you'll make a mistake when trying to solve a quadratic equation. So now once you have all the letters decided on, that in this case here again a is negative 4, negative 3, and 2, then you have to understand how to properly answer the question. If your teacher wants you to find the decimal form or the radical form, that's the next part. So in this case here, you might have a teacher that asks you to find the decimal form or the radical form. Now the radical form means you're going to leave it with the square root involved as part of the answer if it doesn't work out to be a nice answer. So in other words, if the decimal runs off your screen in the calculator, so let's just say you do the quadratic formula and you get something that looks like this on your screen, and you get a decimal that goes way off your screen like this. That would be an example of when you'd probably want to write your answer in radical form. Because if the decimal doesn't work out nicely, then the quadratic, the only way you're going to write the exact form of the answer is in radical form. Okay? So be conscious if your teacher is asking you to leave it, if it's okay to leave it in decimal form or radical form. Okay? Now, let's move on to the next part of this, which is actually trying to solve the equation. Now again, if you don't recall what the formula is, it's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. This is something that you're going to want to remember or write down and keep in your memory or your notebook somewhere so that you can easily get through it in the future. All right, so next, let's just say I have, first of all, this new equation, 5x squared plus 10x minus 12. Now, if I put that in my calculator, or first of all, if my teacher was okay with me solving this in a decimal form, I would then enter all this information into the quadratic formula, first of all knowing that a is 5, right here, b is 10, and c is negative 12. Okay, so you'd write those things down. Then you try to add them into the formula, like you see here. And if you evaluate the formula, it's very important, if you're doing it by hand, to make sure you put parentheses around this b squared part. Okay? When you're putting that b squared part in, if b is negative at any time, it's a lot of times the case, if you don't use parentheses, this will stay as a negative number in the formula and it doesn't work out. When you square a number, it should stay positive. So to avoid that mistake, always put parentheses around the b squared part. And then as for my own preference is that whenever you're substituting anything, it's always a good idea to make sure you're putting parentheses around whatever you're substituting. So I'm substituting this 5 and the negative 12 also into this radical. So just keep it in parentheses, and it'll keep the negative straight and everything else going and working properly. Okay, so after you finish figuring this out right here, this all comes out to be 340 units. And then if you take the radical of that and take that negative 10 plus and negative 10 minus, all the square root of 340, or if you simply just use the quadratic formula in your calculator, the answer will then kick out these two answers right here. Those are rounded answers, understand again, that those are not exact, just like I have here. So the idea that you have to be careful of is then that when a decimal runs off your screen, you're not giving the most accurate answer, just an approximation. Even the calculator here, with all those decimal places, is still an approximation because that decimal does keep on going forever. Now, the last thing then is your teacher might also ask you to write the equation or the answer in radical form. Now, radical form means you're going to evaluate this b squared minus 4ac part, and you get 340, like I said. But then from there, you have to decide, is that radical reduced as far as possible? Now, again, if you think of this perfect square roots that you know the answer to, let's start out with 4, and then we have 9, and then we have 16, and so on, 25, and square root of 36. And there's plenty more out there that you could try to use. Obviously, 340 is a pretty large number, but if you wanted to try to start small, let's say you start with 4. Well, if I broke 340 up and took on my calculator 340 divided by 4, if I got a decimal, then I would know that it didn't go into it. But in this case here, when I take 340 divided by 4, I get 85. So yes, it is something I can split up into two radicals, 4 being the one I know the answer to, and 85 the one I don't. So I'm going to take that 4 and 85 and break it up. And then again, I'm going to look at the square root of 4 and then know the answer to that, which is 2. Okay, so then you put 2 down, and then I'll have negative 10 plus or minus the square root of 2 times the square root of 85 all over 10. Now the last thing you have to realize is that there's 3 terms involved in this fraction. We have the first part here, that negative b part. We have this part right here, and we have this part right here. But of those 3 terms, the only thing you have to be focusing on is the factors that are in the negative 10, the positive 10, and then this 2. If there's a number that you can find that goes into these 3 places right here, then you can reduce it. In this case here, 10, 10, and 2 are all divisible by 2. So we're going to reduce that fraction then and say if 2 goes into negative 10 5 times, 2 goes into 2 once. I could put a 1 here if you want to, but I'm not going to. And then all divided by 5. Now if 85 could break down again, I tried that. Let's just say you were to try to do 85 and it ends in a 5. So let's say you tried to do 85 divided by 5. I know it has to be divisible by that, but then I get a prime number. So you know that 85 can only break down one more time to 5 and 17. So that's not going to help. You don't know the answer to the square root of 5 or 17, so that means we're at the end of the road for this reducing of the radical. This answer right here is the only exact way to write the solution to this quadratic equation. So this is what we call simplest radical form. So again, the process for doing simplest radical form is to figure out the b squared minus 4ac value, then see if you can break it up using the square roots that you know the answer to then simplify that radical like we did here with 4 and 85. Then once you've done that, just check to make sure that all 3 of these numbers on the outsides here are then possibly divisible by the same factor. In this case, they were all divisible by 2, so we reduced it one last time, and then that was the end. Good luck, and hopefully in your future that you're able to write answers both in decimal form and radical form.